Boston, December 16th, 1773. Members of the revolutionary group, the Sons of Liberty, had gathered at the Old South Meeting House to plan out a protest against the British. After they had spent the day working out their protest, Samuel Adams began to lead an army of over 100 revolutionaries to Griffin's Wharf, where the British tea ships had been docked. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, the men boarded the European ships and began dumping the tea off the side of the ships. After about 3 hours, the men had dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into the ocean, causing more than $1 million in damage relative to today's currency. Once the event had subsided, the men immediately fled Boston to evade arrest. Once the news of the event reached London, the British entirely shut down Griffin's Wharf through the Boston Port Act, requiring the colonists to pay for the financial damage done to the East India Company. Many colonists became outraged after experiencing the effects of the 1774 Intolerable Acts, causing many more colonists to turn against the British. The Boston Tea Party is considered to be the first organized rebellion against the British, sparking a revolt that eventually led up to the Revolutionary War. If this initial act of protest had never happened, we may have never gained the independence that we have today. What was the Boston Tea Party?
The Boston Tea Party was a political protest in Boston by the political group the Sons of Liberty on December 16, 1773. Demonstrators disguised as Native Americans destroyed entire shipments of tea sent by the East India Company.
Why were the demonstrators dressed as Native Americans?
The demonstrators were dressed as Native Americans so the British authorities would think that it was the natives destroying the tea, not any colonists.
Why were the Sons of Liberty dumping tea in the first place?
The Boston Tea Party was the apex of resistance against the Tea Act throughout the British colonies. Colonists believed that it violated their rights to be taxed without any representation.
What exactly was the Tea Act?
The Tea Act, passed in 1773 by the Parliament of Great Britain, was a large tax that was put on tea. The act was meant to help the British East India Company survive financially. It also was supposed to cut the extremely large amount of tea held by the company. The colonists were not so much upset by the tax itself, but rather their lack of input.
How did the resistance to the Tea Act begin?
During September and October 1773, 6 ships hauling 600,000 pounds of tea were sent to the colonies from Britain. 3 of them went to Boston, 1 to New York, 1 to Philadelphia, and 1 to Charleston. The colonists learned the specifics of the Tea Act while this tea was being shipped. The Sons of Liberty protested the idea of any sort of taxation without their representation and the amount of power the British government had over their colonies.
What happened the night of the actual event?
In the middle of the meeting at the Old South Meeting House, led by Samuel Adams, people poured out and went to Griffin's Wharf. There were 3 ships holding tea there. A group of 30 to 130 men, dressed as Mohawk warriors, dumped 342 chests of tea into the Atlantic Ocean over the course of 3 hours.
What was the British reaction to the Boston Tea Party?
The British closed off the port of Boston and put in more laws known as the Coercive Acts. In Britain were the Intolerable Acts to the colonists. The laws took away Massachusetts' self-government and other rights, which outraged the colonists. These were key developments that led to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War 2 years later. The British Parliament hoped that Massachusetts would serve as an example of what would happen to other colonies if they participated in events similar to the Boston Tea Party.
What was the legacy of the Boston Tea Party?
After the events of the Boston Tea Party, many Americans considered drinking tea to be unpatriotic, which started the trend of drinking coffee instead. One of the many participants was a Boston shoemaker named George Huis. Here is an excerpt of the eyewitness account he provided, giving us a first-hand look at what happened that night. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately proceeded to execute his orders, first cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks so as thoroughly to expose them to the effects of the water. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way, at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. We then quietly retired to our several places of residence, without having any conversation with each other, or taking any measures to discover who our associates were.
Despite the presence of British ships and crew members, all of the participants left the scene of the protest unharmed, with only one of the many participants being revealed and imprisoned. Immediately after the event, Paul Revere decided to travel to New York to spread the news of the protest. He arrived in Manhattan 4 days later, delivering the following message. We had a greater meeting of body than ever, the country coming in from 20 miles round, and every step was taken that was practicable for the returning of the teas. The moment it was known out of doors that Mr. Roch could not obtain a pass for a ship by the castle, a number of people huzzaed in the street, and in very little time, every ounce of the teas on board the Captain Hall, Bruce, and Coffin was immersed in the bay, without the least injury to the private property. The spirit of the people on this occasion surprised all parties who viewed the scene. After reaching New York, the news was then able to spread throughout all the colonies, inspiring other colonists to engage in similar protests. The actions that the Sons of Liberty undertook that night in 1773 sparked a flame of patriotism that quickly spread across the colonies. This single event united a nation, allowing for us to be able to successfully fight through a revolutionary war, winning us the independence that we all enjoy today. The massive effect that the Boston Tea Party ended up causing makes it one of the most important stands in U.S. history.